Good morning, everyone. If we could please quiet down, we're going to get started. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. If we could please quiet down, we're going to get started. We have many participants on the Zoom, and I know we've all been there when Zoom meetings take quite a while to get started, and it's a little less pleasant than sharing space in this beautiful auditorium. It is so great to see so many people here at the California Natural Resources Agency building here in Sacramento, and a warm welcome to those of you tuning in by Zoom. As the CEO of the California Council on Science and Technology, I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to Science Day 2024. For those who might not be familiar with CCST, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization established at the request of the California legislature in the 80s to provide science and technology advice to policymakers from world-class network of academic and research institutions throughout the state, many of which are represented here in this room. I'd like to give a special thanks, particularly to the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory for providing support to help us bring you this event today. It's our job at CCST to bring the expertise across the network and translate it into actionable and timely advice for the state. We do this through a number of mechanisms, including peer-reviewed reports, expert briefings, and other mechanisms. In fact, we have one workshop coming up on November 18th, where we'll be diving into the research gaps related to hydrogen. If you're interested in attending, please see the registration desk for more details. We also administer the California Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program, where we place up to 15 PhD-level graduates in the legislature and executive branches for a year of public service and leadership training. A quick show of hands, who in this room has been a fellow, has been a mentor, or has been part of a host office? Thank you so much for your service to California. We are so appreciative and in awe of the quality of work that our fellowship program participants are able to make. So all of CCST's work is made possible through partnerships with academic institutions, with federal laboratories, and with the state. It is one of our core values that form the foundation of our work, and it's the reason that we are all here today. We have scientists here from academic and federal institutions from across California's extraordinary research ecosystem who are eager to lend their expertise to the state and to help tackle some of California's most pressing issues. We also have policymakers, state scientists, and program staff here who are working hard to make California more resilient in the face of climate change, to decarbonize the state's economy, to address the biodiversity crisis, and much more. Today we'll hear about examples of where the state and research institutions have partnered to address some of these critical issues. These partnerships will hopefully serve as inspiration and a jumping off point for our discussions throughout the day. I look forward to participating in conversations with many of you throughout the day and hear about your ideas for supporting the development of healthy state research partnerships. I hope we can all leave this beautiful CNRA building with a plan for how we can realize these changes together. Over the course of the day, I invite you to do a number of things, to ask our panelists many questions, to take advantage of their experience and expertise while we're all here sharing space, utilize the networking opportunities to make new connections and to lay the groundwork for future partnerships. And in addition to the mixer at 3 p.m., we have breakout sessions focused on different issue areas that are CNRA priorities, as well as the mechanics of partnership. So a big thank you to CSU Water and CSU Coast, as well as the California Ocean Science Trust for their partnership on breakout sessions. I would also encourage you to chat with our science translators. These are master's and PhD students from throughout the state who participated in a science communication crash course with CCST and are here to talk about their work. You will find them with blue and green ribbons on their name badges. And if you know someone who might want to participate in this program next year, applications are open on our website now. Finally, if you want to be more involved but are not sure how, connect with us at CCST. We'd be happy to help you build partnerships with researchers and or policymakers. And now I'd like to introduce our partner for today's program, as well as a valued collaborator with CCST, the California Natural Resources Secretary, Wade Crowfoot, who has long been a champion of efforts to conserve California's environment and natural resources. notably as an environmental advisor to then Mayor of San Francisco, Gavin Newsom, as well as head of the nonprofit Water Foundation, Deputy Cabinet Secretary and Senior Advisor to then Governor Jerry Brown, and now a leading voice in the Newsom administration. Secretary Crowfoot, I'm happy to pass it to you to lead the first panel. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is really energizing to be here for this second annual Science Day. Big thanks to Julianne. Congratulations on your appointment. CCST is very fortunate to have Julianne leading this institution. She came from leading our precision medicine program at the state of California, a world-renowned initiative that Governor Newsom has been driving. So we're really excited to have you join. And of course, Jason Johns, who is a CCST alumnus, a Natural Resources Agency alumnus, also serving as Deputy Director. So welcome to everybody who is coming to Sacramento today, and big thanks for being here, either in person here at our Natural Resources Agency or online, where we're joined by people from throughout the state and beyond. I want to do something first because today is all about building connections. From my perspective, we have among the world's most ambitious policymakers, the governor, the legislature, our agencies, driving forward on confronting the environmental challenges that we face across the world. And California has the world's best scientific institutions, the UCs, the CSUs, the federally funded research centers. And historically, there hasn't been enough connection between the two. We're making policy decisions, we're making investments of billions of dollars in Sacramento, sometimes without the benefit of the best available science. And likewise, institutions are doing this incredible work. Many of you are doing this incredible work in California, but without access to the decision makers that can actually put your science into action. So we hatched this idea of Science Day to really build this connection. So along those lines, one of the most important things to happen today is for you to build out your own professional network. Whether you're a scientist in state government, we're very proud to have remarkable scientists driving our work in state government, or you're somebody from outside of state government working to build relationships with us here in Sacramento. First, I want to, for those in the room, I want to just do a little bit of a snap poll. Raise your hand if you're from a state department or agency. All right, a lot of us, that's great to see. Raise your hand if you're from the UC or CSU system. All right, great. Raise your hand if you're from a national laboratory or federally funded research center. Excellent, so this is a really good, for those who are joining online, I would say a little over half of us from state government, maybe 30% from UCs or CSUs, and then the balance from those federally funded research centers that we're so lucky to have here in California. So a little bit like a house of worship, I'm going to ask you to turn around and greet your neighbor. But I would say shake hands, not with the person that you came with or that you know, but just quickly introduce yourself to somebody who you haven't met. Okay, I'm going to cut you off. The whole idea is it's meant to whet their appetite, you know, and continue the conversation. Yeah. All right, thanks. Clap once if you can hear me. Clap once if you can hear me. Clap twice if you can hear me. Clap 3 times if you can hear me. All right, that's how my daughter's 5th grade class gets everyone's attention. So look, that's just meant to whet your appetite for the conversations that you can have, and hopefully you'll continue those on the break. But this is all about building connectivity across our disciplines and across our areas of expertise. Science has never been more important in our state or the world, at least from my point of view. If you think about what's happened in the last month alone, we know climate change and our planetary systems are climate change is accelerating and our planetary systems are out of balance. I was talking to colleagues at our Office of Emergency Services about the huge storms that hit North Carolina. And one of the challenges for FEMA and for emergency response is frankly, there was never modeling that suggested that amount of rainfall would come to that part of North Carolina. So we're seeing climate impacts outside of the band of probability or even possibility as a result of climate change. You may know that the city of Phoenix has broken quite a dubious record, which the way I'd explain it is the longest number of concurrent days breaking an all-time heat record. And that is in the last couple of weeks after Phoenix easily broke heat records for the hottest summer it's ever experienced. On the biodiversity front, we have over 1 million species of plants and animals at risk of extinction, and every day we're losing species off our planet. So I would say our imperative to protect, to restore our environment, to really understand how we can exist and thrive as a species on this planet has never been more important. I had the honor of joining Governor Newsom at the Vatican this spring. This current Pope has been a big champion of climate action and gathered world leaders. And I stuck around for the couple of days for a high-level meeting of scientists. The Catholic Church has what's called the Pontifical Academy of Sciences that was actually founded by Galileo to advise the Catholic Church on science, which is sort of ironic when you understand what happened to Galileo. But that academy has actually existed for centuries, and the current Pontifical Academy of Sciences has 82 members, 40 of whom are Nobel laureates. So I got to be a fly on the wall and listen and watch these scientists talk to each other, many of whom are the groundbreaking climate scientists across the planet. And I frankly came back alarmed, if not terrified. And what I would say is it's worse than we thought. We have certain planetary systems that are in danger of spinning out of control. So that's not to depress us or to paralyze us with a sense of pessimism, but it's to really say that it's now or never in terms of what we need to be doing. So the work that you all do, whether it's working to protect our fisheries from extinction, whether it's working to get our arms around catastrophic wildfire, whether it's working to optimize technologies to transition to 100% clean energy, your work matters. And I think we can all be proud that we'll be able to tell the next generation and that next generation of our work at this critical moment in time. And I'll say that California is an incredibly important place to be doing this work. As I shared, we have among the most ambitious policy to confront these environmental challenges, and really compared to anywhere else in the world. Consider this. We have a state law that mandates our entire state, the 5th largest economy in the world if measured by GDP, to transition to 100% carbon-free energy in the next 20 years. We have a state law that requires this huge state, almost a nation state, to transition to carbon neutrality or net zero carbon in just over 20 years. Both of those targets by 2045. And if you think these are moonshots, I would agree, these are moonshots. But we don't feel like we have an alternative or an option. From our perspective, the world needs to transition off fossil fuels. We need to continue to find ways to power our economies without generating carbon pollution. We need to sequester carbon both through natural systems and the restoration, protection of natural systems, but also engineered carbon. And we need to demonstrate to the world that we can do it. And given our scale, if we do that, that is the most powerful proof point on planet Earth that's happening right now. And we're making progress. Remember that in 2007, when our legislature and the governor signed Assembly Bill 32, AB 32, we were among the first governments in the world to set a legal mandate to reduce carbon pollution. At the time, AB 32 required us to reduce pollution to 1990 levels by 2020, and we did so 3 years early. Right now, this year, almost 2/3 of the electrons that power our economy, our world, our buildings, our lives, is carbon-free. I learned from my colleague David Hochschild, who leads the California Energy Commission this morning, that we've had, I think, 137 days in recent months where the grid at some point during the day has been powered entirely on clean energy. We had an electric vehicle goal that we set during Governor Brown's administration. I was right in the middle of that, to have 1.5 million zero-emission vehicles on California's roads by 2025. We collectively met that 3 years early. So California is setting ambitious goals, and we're reaching and exceeding those goals. But I have to tell you that clean energy goal, that carbon neutrality goal, are the most ambitious of all. And they're going to require scientific breakthroughs and the use of science, the application of science that we haven't yet realized. And so Science Day today, the partnerships that you have, the partnerships that we'll build, the partnerships we'll create, are critical to this work. And I don't think we get to where we need to go as California or the world without it. Now, I'll say that we're building on a strong foundation. Many of you may represent institutions that already do this work, and some of those institutions are part of our fabric. I saw Liz Whiteman, who leads the Ocean Science Trust. The Ocean Science Trust is built into California law as a scientific advisor to our agency and our Ocean Protection Council. So that's a really good example where our policymakers have institutionalized that scientific exchange. We're evolving and creating new institutions or new advisory bodies all the time. I'm so excited to see colleagues here from CAL FIRE. We have a wildfire task force, a wildfire and forest resilience task force, where for the first time we're getting our arms around all of the work that we're doing before wildfire ever comes to build our wildfire resilience. And we've got the federal government and tribes and local governments and state government all together. And for the first time, we have a scientific advisory committee chaired by a professor from UC Berkeley and a professor from the USDA that is guiding all of the investments that we're making, upwards of $5 billion of investments in wildfire resilience being driven by science. And in this auditorium in December, that really most of our task force meeting will be hearing from those scientists around what we're learning, what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and how to adaptively manage wildfire resilience work. We have our biodiversity network that you'll hear more about. That really has been put together to support the state's biodiversity work, but also our own moonshot on nature, which is to protect 30% of California's water, lands and coastal waters by 2030. Biodiversity Network, a fairly new institution. We have our Delta Independent Science Board to help navigate the big questions of how we protect that biodiversity hotspot and still provide water to most of the state. So I would say this: science has never been more important. The partnerships that are growing in this room and across the state are more critical than ever, and we're building on some great momentum. So I am really looking to CCST to help us do more of this, help us get more of these institutions together, but also just get more projects going. The fact is, I come across science that's happening in California every month that I wish that we could apply more to our work in state government. And a lot of that's already happening, probably with a lot of you in the room, but so much more of that can happen. And imagine that, if you're a scientist, that the work that you're doing, the groundbreaking research that you're doing is actually being applied. And if you're a decision maker in California, whether that's a manager in the Department of Water Resources or Fish and Wildlife or Department of Conservation, if you were able to access the world's best science to help you make decisions and then monitor the effectiveness of your decisions, that's what we're talking about here. So I couldn't be prouder that Science Day is now a thing, that we're doing it for the second straight year. And I just have to say, we are very focused on how to build these connections, how to ensure that California can continue to lead, that we can support your institutions, if you're from UC, CSUs, these federally funded research institutions, and that how your work can support the progress that we're making. Ultimately, I'm optimistic. You know, the way I think about it is optimism is no longer a choice, it's really a discipline. And if you're a scientist doing this work, it's easy to look at the science and it can be, you know, it can feel a little forlorn. But I think we're the ones that actually maintain hope by taking action. I follow a scientist named Katharine Hayhoe, who spends a lot of her time trying to break down climate science and help people understand what we're facing, but also the opportunities. And in the book I read that she wrote, she said, you know, it's easy to get discouraged, but we maintain hope by taking action. And that's what I do every day, and I think that's what we all do. So here's to doing more of it, and here's to doing more of it together. So with that, we're going to transition to understanding partnerships and how partnerships on the ground are working. And so I'd invite my 4 panelists up to the stage to begin that conversation. And please join me in welcoming them. So to kick things off today, we've got a great opportunity to talk to essentially 4 leaders that are driving scientific partnerships in California. And we've organized this discussion in really duos. We're gonna talk about partnerships in watershed science and watershed management. And then we're gonna talk about partnerships in the work that we're doing to conserve biodiversity and 30 by 30. And we're going to ask each of our panelists who could spend the entire day talking about their work, but to come up to the podium and share a little bit about their work and their perspective on these scientific partnerships. So I am first going to introduce Louise Conrad. Louise serves as lead scientist at our Department of Water Resources. You probably know our Department of Water Resources, over 3,000 people in state government, is really driving all of our work to provide water to Californians and the California economy. It does not only does it administer the State Water Project, really the backbone of our water system of systems, but is doing all of the long-range planning on how we continue to provide stable water, but also manage our water systems for fish and wildlife and the many benefits just beyond water supply. Louise served as a leader at the Delta Stewardship Council in the past and brings just a tremendous amount of scientific expertise to this work. So Louise, welcome.
Great to be here with Secretary Crowfoot and these wonderful panelists. And thank you to the CNRA and CCST teams that are convening us today. So I do come into this conversation with a lens and experience in fisheries, watershed sciences, invasive species, and I am, as the Secretary mentioned, serving in a broader role now for Department of Water Resources as lead scientist. And I'm excited to talk about science partnerships from the perspective of the whole agency, I hope. It's a big task. I think, as has already been said, these science partnerships are so crucial, and we are here today because we need them to advance how we can smartly manage our precious natural resources. We cannot do it in silos. We have to work together. The point I really want to drive home here is that our ability to do this rests on the vibrance, health of our communities that we build together. Without functioning working relationships, that sounds elementary, but it is so important. That is the platform with which we build new partnerships. So this means to me that in addition to being good scientists, we have to be great communicators, and we have to be very diligent and attentive community builders. That takes a lot of dedication. And I'm going to choose a few examples here from DWR work on how this has really benefited us when we've had champions that are taking care of relationships and communities of science and communities of practice through their work. So in this first example, I want to cover forecasting and water supply management. Now, this is really clearly core to DWR work. This is essential to our job. Secretary has already explained that very well. What people might not know is how much academic partnerships have been at the basis and really driving how we innovate in this part of our work. And there's two aspects I want to point to with this. One is we have a research and operation partnership with the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes that is based in the UC San Diego Scripps Institution for Oceanography. And this partnership is led by Dr. Michael Anderson, who has a position as state climatologist. His position is actually pretty interesting to shine a light on briefly because it embodies collaboration. It is jointly supported by the state and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So it's coming for this collaborative support to have a state climatologist that can help guide how we're approaching forecasting and water supply management. And in this partnership, DWR scientists are part of a technical working group that has about 10 entities involved and are meeting regularly to help inform how we can forecast and improve our ability to predict atmospheric rivers, which, as you know, are very important to California's water supply and also very important to, and can be very important for potential emergencies. So through doing this, they have been able to advance the timeline that we have to predict atmospheric rivers. This is really important in 2023 when upwards of 30 atmospheric rivers hit landfall. This group was able to predict those and think more nimbly about how we then manage reservoir operations and then prepare for potential emergencies. But it's about more than the short-term planning. It is also about the longer-term planning. And there again, partnerships with academic institutions, this time on the East Coast, University of Massachusetts, Cornell University. We've engaged with experts there to think about how we can appropriately think about how climate stressors are going to impact our ability to deliver water. This work is resulting in modeling tools that are relevant and accessible to water managers, even at the local scale, and is now what we are using to predict our ability to deliver water in a biennial delivery capability report for the State Water Project. So that is a huge body of work, and I'm going to shift gears really quickly to talk a little bit about species management and developing genetic tools to enhance the information we have about the biological communities that are inhabiting our rivers and wetlands. So this is lesser known aspect of DWR work, but it's a really big one. DWR scientists collect quite a bit of biological and ecological data because part of our mission is to enhance the sustainability of these systems. And with that, we need to pay attention to the ecology. So this genetic tools term might sound a little obscure, but it represents quite a bit of collaboration with UC Davis and other academic institutions and also the private industry now, where we are partnering with experts on how to get better information on population dynamics of species that are managed, such as salmon. This has led to advancements in how fast we can get information on what species are present and whether we need to be adjusting operations for them. That's really important when you have salmon runs moving through the system concurrently, that some are protected, some are not at that stage yet. And more recently, these same partnerships have evolved to encompass also environmental DNA, which is something I am very excited about. This is the DNA that organisms leave behind as they pass through their environment. And we, for short, call it eDNA. And why this is exciting is because by taking a water sample and applying a genetic test to it, we have learned that you can detect who's there. And that brings so much power to the efficiency and the sensitivity of information that we can get. And this is, I want to be clear, this has not been discovered through our specific partnerships. It's really gaining traction worldwide in terms of the biological data, how we can collect this data and get more of it, even through automatic sampling. We can get quite a bit of information that even would support the biodiversity network that the Secretary spoke of in his remarks. So through our partnerships, we've been able to do a lot of pilot work to figure out how this specific tool could be applied to some of our work at DWR. And we were so excited about it that we developed our own DWR eDNA strategy, which you can find online. And it harmonizes with a national aquatics eDNA strategy that was recently released by the White House Office of Science and Technology. So this harmonization is no accident. It's because geneticists that we work with, that we have in our own agency, and that work with geneticists across different states, are already talking about what the potential of this tool is, how we can be using it, and what are we going to need to do to operationalize it so that we can use it to provide defensible, consistent data on how restoration of wetlands, for example, is working for the communities that we're trying to serve, the biological communities that we're trying to support. So we're really proud to say that because of these partnerships, we were even able to get to Washington, D.C. earlier this year to present our own DWR environmental strategy, eDNA strategy, at an international conference and really talk with folks from Europe and Washington State on how we can apply this and how we can do it all together in a way that supports a really broad network. So there are many examples of partnerships. I just want to finish by touching back on this communities aspect, the science communities that we are supporting and how important they are, and how do we build and maintain them. And what I want to point out is that in all the examples I just highlighted, there are perhaps decades of collaboration underlying them. There are very well cared for relationships. In many cases, there's conferences, there's field projects and field-based site visits, brainstorming that people are willing to keep coming to. It's that consistency, continuing to show up, be there together, and continue to learn. And sometimes those relationships do need to be formalized with a funding agreement or a memorandum of understanding where we're acknowledging and formalizing our ability to work together. Sometimes that means supporting early career scientists that then become aware of the management challenges and bring their own network to this community so it can be growing, evolving with the people and the issues that we are facing. I also want to note that we have to create opportunities and platforms for building connections we might not even know about yet. We don't always know about the science that we need until we hear about it. And that means that it's really important to be maintaining our engagement with professional societies and being at professional conferences within the state, but also even broader. We have to be state scientists and academic, non-governmental organizations all need to be able to come and be present at some of the same conferences where information can be shared and we can pay attention to that. The way we do this is my last point that I want to make, is that it requires a culture of support for this kind of interaction throughout leadership all the way down to entry-level scientists so that we can be bringing our science and learning from others at those opportunities where we have that chance to meet people that we haven't met yet and we don't yet know their work. So thank you very much. I will pass it along to Dr. Viers.
I am so proud of the work that DWR is doing, and you didn't blow your own horn, but I'm so proud that DWR was invited by the White House to actually serve on a body that is advising on eDNA and this environmental approach to fisheries management. And I think we're the only state agency that's serving in that capacity on this White House task force. So huge. I want to just make a couple of points because I thought your examples were excellent. I can tell you that this partnership as it relates to atmospheric rivers saved lives in 2023. I sat in the State Operations Center in Rancho Cordova, about 15 miles to the east, every day when Dr. Anderson, who's the state's climatologist, we have one of the only state climatologists in the country who is funded, as you said, both by the federal government and the state government, every day would use this modeling that was a partnership of Scripps to identify the probability of where the atmospheric rivers would make landfall and what volume of water that they would bring. That allowed us to pre-position assets through our Office of Emergency Services, through CAL FIRES and others, and it was remarkable. And I remember our colleagues, our emergency services colleagues, were blown away that science was being applied in such a precise, actionable way, and it was a huge deal. And then fisheries management, which of course is challenging in California, particularly with salmon. Pacific salmon, we're at the southern end of their range. They're a set of species that are really water temperature dependent, so they're already really stressed. And of course, we have to balance building our economy and providing water to 40 million Californians, but also helping these fish recover. I think we need breakthroughs like eDNA, and so I'm so excited about that. I'm also really geeked out recently on the work that Dr. Carson Jeffries and others are doing to identify the isotopes in the irises of salmon, to identify how long they've spent on our floodplains and which floodplains. So this type of science is actually breakthrough science as far as I'm concerned. That's going to help us improve our environmental management and, frankly, our emergency response. So huge thanks for providing those examples. Okay, Dr. Joshua Viers helps lead the watershed work from a research and academic perspective at the UC Merced. University of California, Merced, remarkable research institution. I'm also really proud that UC Merced was just voted the #1 university in the entire nation as it relates to social mobility. And providing Californians an opportunity to grow their prosperity and opportunity. And Dr. Viers, you are at the School of Engineering. You focus on watershed science, watershed management, and you're also doing some really interesting work on some federal initiatives, both with artificial intelligence and the technology that we can apply to the future of food production. So I'd invite you to the podium to share your thoughts on partnerships.
Good morning, and thank you. That's a very kind introduction, and it's certainly with some humility that I stand before you, in part to be the voice for all of higher education in California. I suspect that many of you have degrees and cut your teeth on a college campus, and I was one of those that never left, and sometimes I certainly benefit from that and enjoy that time, but also recognize a lot of good work happens off campus. As we're well aware, universities are now kind of at the forefront of social discourse, and it's certainly a challenging time. I think learning has always been a challenge, right? That we'd like to challenge ourselves in that discourse and to stretch our minds in a lot of ways, and I think that's what makes being on a college campus really exciting. The University of California, the California State University system, and the community colleges of California are really the premier public learning institutions in the world. And that's something that I'm very proud to be a part of. I myself went to a community college and ultimately matriculated to the University of California and stayed on to get a PhD. I think higher education is changing pretty rapidly. Nationally, enrollments are down, in fact. There's less interest, there's less trust, and there's a certain degree of anti-intellectualism that is unfortunately very pervasive in our country at this time. I think that can change, but I also think that higher education probably needs to change with the times too. The idea of spending 6 years in monastic silence to get a PhD probably is a little outmoded, and we need to rethink that. As I've heard in the past, probably fewer big meals and more snacks. So, as we move forward, look for higher education to change in terms of educational delivery. But I think the research aspect of what we do will always remain important. And I'm going to touch on a few of the things that we're doing that may be of interest to you. But as you were told about the University of California, Merced, I think it's really important to note that the University of California evolved. It took time, took decades really, to recognize that there was an educational desert in the San Joaquin Valley, that there was a gap in higher education and mobility, and that was something that they set out to do. It took a little while to put that campus into place, but we will turn 20 years old, believe it or not, in this coming year. And in less than 20 years, we've grown to 10,000 students, most of those from the San Joaquin Valley. 88% of them are non-white, 3 out of 4 first-generation college goers, 2 out of 3 receive federal aid, and nearly 1 out of 10 are undocumented. It really is the face of California, and we're now serving a population that has been largely underserved and lacked access to higher education. So being ranked #1 in social mobility, which is great, that was the Wall Street Journal. #3 by US News, I don't know if I believe them, but they used to call that exceeds expectations. I'd like to think we could expect more. Right, and I think we do of ourselves, and certainly hold ourselves to a high standard within the state of California in higher education. Partly that's in the educational delivery, right, but also being the research arm for the state of California and working through some of those partnerships. So I'm just going to kind of hit the tops of the Sierras and work my way down. But University of California research, and certainly some at the Merced campus, has been instrumental in better understanding snowpack through the Airborne Snow Observatory, the use of LIDAR, scanning entire mountainsides to really not only understand the volume of snow we have, but the snow water equivalent, being able to translate that through hydrologic models to understand how much of that's absorbed in the soil, how much of it is evaporated, and transpired through the forests and soils themselves, and ultimately to those runoff models. And we heard a little bit about that forecast-informed runoff, and that becomes incredibly important for the west slope of the Sierra Nevada. And more importantly, how we manage those dams and reservoirs for multiple purposes. So university researchers, including some of my own PhD students, are using advanced techniques and artificial intelligence. This is predictive AI as opposed to generative AI, to really understand where we can optimize not just delivery for cities and farms, which are incredibly important, but also for the environment. You may have heard a little bit about functional flows, delivering the right amount of water to the right place at the right time for the right purpose. That is not easily done from an engineering perspective. It requires foresight. You need to know how much you have in the bank before you can spend it. That's where some of these new tools are actually coming into play to allow us to better understand the timing and the amount of skill that is necessary to be able to bank on that water. In a recent study, we were able to show that the memory, if you will, in our systems is actually quite short, which is to say we had a really wet year in 2023, and we wanted to understand what the climate whiplash may look like, in so much as what if we had 2 back-to-back wet years? What would that do for us? Because we've filled up our reservoirs and we're feeling pretty good. Well, as it turns out, following 5 years of dry and 2 years of wet, we only get about 50% return on value, if you will, in how we operate those systems. We don't bank enough water as we go forward, which means that we're going to have to kind of change the rules of the game. That becomes important for our floodplains. So if we think about the forests and we think about forest fire and all the breakthroughs and really understanding that, we're now just starting to understand the power of floodplains and letting rivers do the work for us. So these setback levees, which preserve flood hazard reduction for our cities and farms, also create opportunities for floodplains to function in ways that we never knew possible. So Carson Jeffries, in his master's thesis, perhaps the simplest thesis ever, but the most powerful punch, being able to show that salmon raised on floodplains get bigger faster, and that way they survive the outmigration to the ocean, the greater likelihood to return and reproduce. They, in fact, are the incubators, if you will, of our aquatic ecosystems, and in turn, provide us the opportunity to really understand carbon cycling and so forth. You mentioned eDNA. One of our students at UC Merced, Jacob Nesledge, not only found the riparian brush rabbit at Grayson, a river partner site, in the soil eDNA, but was able to actually couple that with hyperspectral remote sensing from a drone, which means that in the future, we may be able to just scan the surface of the soils and understand what species may be there. These are really big breakthroughs. I'd like to close in thinking about that partnership and policy. I came through a program that had people that were very active in policy. Dr. Jeff Mount, some of you may know him as Dr. Doom. And he once said, it's always darkest before it goes pitch black. He's a bit of a cynic. I can't be at times too, but I'd like to think that today is actually, it's brighter than it's ever been. We have the tools. We're in the right place. As I've been told, you need to have empathy, right? Like, we're in this together. You need to have the resources. That's our collective action. And we need to have a proven track record. And I think we've shown that. Thanks for your time.
Joshua, thanks so much. Just a little bit of colored commentary to emphasize points. First of all, this Airborne Snow Observatory. It took me a little bit of time to actually understand its benefit for Department of Water Resources, but we had this remarkable situation in 2022. This was the tail end of the driest 3-year period in the state's history. Based on a 100-year hydrograph, 100 years of history of how the snow melts and goes into the reservoirs, our colleagues at the Department of Water Resources were anticipating a certain amount of inflow into our state's largest state-managed reservoir, Oroville. And that year, about 30% of that inflow materialized, meaning that reservoir got only 30% of the snow melt that we could expect based on 100 years of history. And that for us, and certainly for the Director of the Department of Water Resources, Carla Namath, was the aha moment that we can no longer base our water management on the historic record, but we have to use the best available science. And so this Airborne Snow Observatory is a big deal because whereas before we used to measure, we'd go up there manually and measure snowpack and have that translate into water, it's far more complicated than that. The water content, the density, the reflective nature of the snowpack all impact supply. And so actually I was at somewhere recently and one of the water managers from, I think, the Kings River just said, if you do nothing else, continue to fund the Airborne Snow Observatory because it's been the single most important tool for us to manage our water supply. So I thought that was really powerful. The second point I'll make is the role that technology plays in restoring natural systems. Too often technology and nature are presented as sort of a binary choice. And for too long in California, we've thought about technology apart from nature. And yet, the work that you're doing and that your grad students doing to use that technology to actually reintroduce the endangered species, this riparian brush rabbit in the San Joaquin Valley, a great example of how we leverage technology to actually restore natural systems, whether they're, riparian or the floodplain. So I'm really also energized by those two examples that you give. So you can see some of the connectivity, some of the progress we're making between our best science inside government, outside of government, and how it's actually impacting our water management. I want to now shift to the work that we do to protect biodiversity. You may know that California is considered by global biodiversity scientists as one of the world's 36 biodiversity hotspots, which means we have a richness, a diversity of animals, plants, and other life forms almost unparalleled on planet Earth. It's remarkable. 40% of our plant species in California only grow in California. So from our perspective, we have both a responsibility but an incredible opportunity to demonstrate to the world how we can operate the 5th largest economy in the world and a virtual nation state of 40 million people while protecting this incredible richness that once we lose, we'll never get back. So this has involved a governmental, non-governmental partnership that we're excited to feature now, and we'll do so first by introducing my colleague, Meghan Hertel. Meghan is a colleague of mine right upstairs on the 20th floor. She serves as our Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat, which was a position we created to uplift this priority. She spent a decade at the Audubon Society, focused and leading California's work on land and water and the interaction between the two. She built a reputation for collaboration on some of the thorniest issues and projects in California, all centered on California water and land conservation. And then she made an interesting jump to Land Life, which is a private sector company that's focused on conservation through the application of technology. And then we were lucky enough to poach her from the private sector back here. And now she leads both our 30 by 30 initiative, again, conserving 30% of California by 2030. We have to conserve 5 million more acres of land over the next 5 years. No pressure, Meghan. But also the effort to cut green tape, which is how do we reduce the bureaucracy so we can get more of this environmental restoration on the ground more quickly and cost effectively. So Meghan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Secretary. I'd like to clarify it's 4.8 million acres, just to set the record straight on that. I'm so thrilled to be here today. Roughly 20 years ago, when I started looking at graduate programs, I faced a choice. I could either go into environmental science or I could go into environmental policy. There were very few programs that actually knitted the two of them together. I ended up going to this very small school in Massachusetts, in Worcester, because it was one of the first places that was trying to teach people to knit the two, right? To have a science understanding, but be able to communicate to policymakers and decision makers. So I'm so thrilled to be here, A, because I can't believe it's 20 years later, and that makes me feel very old, but also because this whole room is thinking about that, right? And the state of California is doing just that. We are taking science in the real time, using it to make decisions. There's so much more we need and so much more we can do. So thank all of you for your effort for being here. Like the Secretary said, I have the great privilege of leading the state's 30 by 30 initiative. And so that's the effort to conserve 30% of our water and 30% of our coastal lands and internal lands for biodiversity, right? We need to reverse the catastrophic loss that's happening. This really got started when Governor Newsom executed an executive order in January 2020, but I want to back up because the real call for this started with scientists. There were scientists all over the world that were doing studies and talking about the mass extinction that was happening and getting frustrated that they weren't seeing decision makers or governments taking action to reverse that. And part of it is because we had these amazing studies that were showing the loss of species, but there was very little ability for people to understand how do you address that? It feels so overwhelming. It's almost like this issue of climate change. Then this movement to conserve 30% took shape. And what that did is it took science and gave it a framework under which decision makers could sign on to, practitioners could start the movement under, and it gave us a joint goal and joint messaging to push toward reversing this loss that we're facing. So after the governor instituted the executive order in 2020, it really started a movement. Shortly thereafter, the federal government passed the America the Beautiful initiative, which is the federal 30 by 30 effort. And then 2 years ago, over 190 countries signed on to this same target and this same goal. And really thrilled that California is one of the first ones to do it and really has been leading the way. But we knew that when we set this target, it wasn't enough just to have a number. It wasn't enough to say, okay, we need to get 5 million more acres. How do you do it? What is it informed? Where do you put those acres? And so we took 18 months in a public process to create our Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy document. So thrilled because there's multiple authors of that document in the room here. Can you raise your hand, actually, if you supported or contributed to the 30 by 30 Pathways document? Actually, maybe you two should just stand up because you did an amazing job. 2 scientists that helped contribute to it. Wow, neither of you are going to stand up. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Yeah, there you go. This was 18 months of a public process during COVID and the pandemic, so not an easy thing to do, but it had over 70 tribal consultations, multiple regional workshops, and expert advisory committees that were bringing cutting-edge science to inform how do we get there. If you have time, go online. There's an entire appendix that lays out what science studies are needed as we continue to implement 30 by 30. And a lot of that is being done both by state agencies, but also by NGOs and external partners through the California Biodiversity Network. So a couple things I want to point out about this strategy that I think are relevant for all of you that are continuing to do science and lead the way on that. So part of the strategy is that we're both committed to reversing biodiversity loss, but also addressing climate resilience and mitigation and improving equitable access. And more in my role, I'm thinking about how do we get these multiple benefits? How do we tie them together and what are the trade-offs? And we need science to help inform that. Josh, I think you referenced this a bit in your talk, right? Like what are the different levers we have? You need to know and understand how they can overlap, where we can get multiple benefits, and where we have to make choices. The other piece I'll say is we've got 3 core commitments under 30 by 30. It's to include equity, justice, and inclusion, to do it through tribal partnerships, and to improve equitable access. Social sciences, right? If we want to get conservation done on the ground, we need both the hardcore biological science, we need the engineering, and we need to understand how to get people to do it. And so I would encourage all of us in the room to think about partnerships that include both the technical science and the social science component. It's more and more important these days. So we are on track for 30 by 30. We just released our annual report last month. We're a little bit over 25% on the land side, 16.2% on the coastal water side. We have more to go, which means we need more science to inform that process. Questions we've got that we need help on is how are these parcels connected? How can we better connect them so that we can have movement of animals and species? The Department of Fish and Wildlife is doing some incredible work on tracking species movement. There's a lot of external academics also working on it. Where do we need to build those bridges, fix those underpasses? We also need to make sure that we're preserving and conserving the right places in California. Have we protected the broad breadth of biodiversity that we've got in this state? Have we done it in the regions where we need to do it? And then how are we setting an example for the rest of the world and the rest of this country about how you can advance 30 by 30 through science and in an inclusive fashion and still have a strong economy? All questions that we need to advance. So I will just wrap up by saying 30 by 30 was inspired by science. It was built on science, and we need science to keep it going. So I am incredibly appreciative of just one of the people we've got on this panel that is contributing to that.
Meghan, thanks so much. Just one point of color commentary. So glad you brought up the social sciences, because so often when we think about science, we think about the so-called hard sciences without the social science. And I'll share that I mentioned that the Vatican has this Pontifical Academy of Sciences. They actually have established a Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences as well, which is essentially the partner organization. So during that week at the Vatican, there were some of the world's best social scientists too, talking about really what it's going to take to actually make these things happen. So as your companion in this talk, we have Dr. Jeanette Howard. And Dr. Howard leads the land science program for the Nature Conservancy. And I imagine we all know the Nature Conservancy, or TNC, but this is a global conservation organization. And one of the things I love about TNC is they are action and results oriented. So yes, policy, but fundamentally, how do we get more good conservation on the ground? This is also a premier scientific organization. And as probably Dr. Howard will tell us, that the Nature Conservancy has done a lot of work in California understanding how do we protect that biodiversity. As Meghan said, 30 by 30 is not just an end, it's really just a means to an end. And we're not just focused on protecting land for acres' sake, but to actually preserve biodiversity. Before you led the land program, you led the water program, which is critical given the interactivity. And then you also, in your career, served or worked for the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation, which is, I hope we can get the tribal leadership and aspects into this discussion later. So without further ado, Dr. Howard.
All right, thanks everybody. As Secretary Crowfoot said, I'm a director of science at the Nature Conservancy. I'm also serving as the co-chair of the, as Meghan mentioned, the California Biodiversity Network, which is a kind of a movement or a partnership of various people interested in biodiversity. It currently is composed of about 900 individuals, making up about 130 entities. And if you are interested in joining us, please do. There's a website, and we always are welcoming everyone. So so much like as Meghan said, I'm really excited about 30 by 30, and I'm really excited to be partnering with the state on that. I imagine I'm feeling much like people did around 50 years ago who had worked to develop and pass the Coastal Act. As a Californian who's lived in different coastal states, I marvel almost every day at the courageous and visionary landmark legislation that was enacted in 1976 to save our coast, which protected coastal areas, which provided access to everyone, and balanced development and conservation. Imagine what our coasts would have looked like if that hadn't passed. I mean, you can just see like a Las Vegas type environment on the sands of the white sands of Carmel with a Cirque du Soleil tent hovering by Point Lobos. Really glad 50 years ago people had the vision to move forward. So what's really cool about this time also, as Meghan mentioned, is that California is not alone in this. This is 190 nations that are working to preserve and protect and manage effectively 30% of the world's terrestrial, inland waters, and coastal marine environments. That's amazing, right? I mean, it's just amazing. It's big, it's audacious, and let's face it, it's quite daunting, really, when you think about it. And science has a really huge role, I think, to play in this, as we've heard today, and to really optimize this moment and to really to take action and make sure that we're doing the absolutely best we can do. So I see two really important ways that science can help the state inform California's 30 by 30 rules. And the first is helping inform what and how we protect those 4.8 million acres over the next 5 years. And then once protected, how do we manage those lands effectively? And so a first good step is to look at what biodiversity is already protected in the acreage that is within 30 by 30. And also then and at the same time, what is missing? And the California Biodiversity Network is currently conducting an analysis in coordination with the state to actually do that, which we hope will lead to next step for implementation and action. So there are 75 million acres of land that aren't within the 30 by 30 protected lands network, so there's a lot of flexibility. And there's a lot of flexibility to get to those 4.8 million acres. And in my humble opinion, the foundation of that should be, or could be, representation of all the major ecosystem types in the state, and also the application of good conservation planning and network design principles. And really a key to the long-term protection of biodiversity in the state is a resilient and connected network of protected lands. That this will avoid ecological islands, it protects the linkages and climate migration routes that are going to be really important for species to move, and so it provides this kind of really natural highways for movement with these migration highways, really. And how do we get there? So TNC recently published a paper in Conservation Science and Practice just last month that really laid out an approach to efficiently implement 30 by 30. And it was based on these two assertions. One is this representation idea, and also efficiency. And what we learned is that we can meet our representation and climate resilient network goals and do it in an efficient manner. But like Meghan said, there will always be trade-offs. And whether it be cost, whether it be participation by all regions and by all actors, or the ability to advance multiple objectives. But surfacing those trade-offs and being transparent about them in an analytical framework is really going to be the key to success. That analysis looked only at private lands, which is of course going to be part but not all of the solutions. So to protect those next 4.8 million acres, we need to be looking at lands other than private and how to get there. And in collaboration with the state, as we move forward, I'm really hoping that we can take that analysis to one step further to really look at potential management changes on public lands to actually get within the tent of 30 by 30 and get there efficiently as possible with the best available science. So once we have it protected, not only does science help there, but then the next step is the management of those protected lands for biodiversity. And without good management and monitoring and stewardship, really protected lands are lines on maps. So improving and tracking effectiveness of biodiversity with systems like the Sentinel Network now, and Ryan Peaks here that is working on that, and DFW and the California Biodiversity Network, improving the management of the effectiveness for biodiversity and ensuring local support and establishing long-term financing for stewardship are really key to ensuring that conservation will last in perpetuity. And we can do this. We can do it. To get there, we will require decision-making and trade-offs and partnerships like we're forming today. And I don't think it's going to be really easy, but I'm confident that we can get there so that in 50 years from now, people will be in this very auditorium and marveling at the success of 30 by 30. So thanks very much.
Jeanette, thanks so much, and I love the model. Just again to put a point as a concrete example. we in the state have this target that the state legislature has now passed as a law, the governor signed, so we know we need to get to 30 by 30. And we've got incredible state scientists here and across the agency, but we've got so much focus on things that are, responsibilities we have. So because this biodiversity network exists, we're able to turn to it and say, hey, help us answer this big question. What are the ecosystems, what are the habitats that we need to prioritize, that are the most endangered, the most precious? 30 by 30 is not some list that we're managing in Sacramento about where to conserve. It's the result of resource conservation district, land trusts, tribes, local governments. But we need to basically be able to identify, well, in state government, where do we need to lean in? What areas do we need to lean in to protect biodiversity? And we would just never be able to do this on our own within departments given capacity constraints. So the biodiversity network is now going to go off and answer that question, which is going to guide the decision making that we have in terms of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of investment in conservation. So it's a great example. All right, I want to turn to you and keep in mind that you saw people raise their hands who are in the room. We have so many more joining us by Zoom. They're not going to necessarily be watershed scientists or biodiversity experts. So we're going to kind of lift it up and try to track some sort of key principles that could guide partnerships. And the first one is key ingredients. What do you think are key ingredients in these partnerships between government, non-government to be successful? I really liked your point, Louise, about the building relationships and the fact that these partnerships don't just happen on a dime after a couple of meetings. So the benefit of building those relationships, taking time to build those relationships, and learn, even learn when you don't know what questions that you're to ask, but to scan the landscape for the research. So I like that as one ingredient. But what anything other ingredients to success that people here joining us today can take with them?
Well,
Don't be shy.
Sure, I'll just jump in and say that relationships are incredibly important. As I mentioned early on, most of us went to college at some point, and those foundational friendships often turn into professional ones. And I'm always just amazed at the scientists within state agencies that I went to school with, but in turn are now using their expertise and really their position to affect the questions that we can ask within academia, right? So it's a two-way street. We're always supposed to come up with these good ideas, but maybe our ideas aren't the best. And so being able to actually exchange those ideas, set an agenda, and then put that army of undergrads to work behind it trying to solve it.
Josh, I'd like that an army of undergrads. Oh, thank you. We'll take advantage of that army of undergrads. I would add to that, right? So not only helping jointly set the questions that need to be answered, but also thinking about the timeline. So one of the things I really struggle with is we have to make decisions, we have to set policies and take actions that doesn't always align with the timelines that really good science needs. And so understanding what our timelines and pressures we're facing so that either we can get some feedback early or there's decision points or we can share information so we can all keep moving while the science proceeds.
Yeah, and to your point, we don't work at the pace of peer-reviewed, published science. So a lot of times what we need to say is, hey, in the next 6 months, we have to make this decision. And hopefully we have relationships where we can call up scientists that aren't already in our institutions and maybe ask their opinion, their perspective. That maybe is scary for external scientists because this is not overly official, but it's like that type of rapid pace decision-making that sometimes we're doing. Louise.
Jeanette, yeah.
So Jeanette.
One thing that I think is really understanding where it's a science question and where it's policy. So science that relationship, really understanding what is our objective and where are we trying to get to, but also then, where does science end and where does policy begin and intermix? And so I think science can answer a lot and do a lot, but I think also policy then has to take the best available and make those decisions that are not going to be easy decisions. And sometimes science cannot solve these issues, right? There aren't always win-wins and there's hard decisions. And so that's one thing I think is really disentangling sometimes, as well as mixing and the relationship between, but understanding where policy and science are separate and how science informs, but then when does policy take in?
Yeah, and your point that you made up at the podium about trade-offs, at the end of the day, we are balancing. And so sometimes the decisions we make, for example, on California water are not popular with, whether it's an environmental group that's solely focused on fish or an agricultural group that's worried about, water supply. But we have to do that. Louise, one thing we talked about right before this is adaptive management, science for adaptive management. A lot of science sometimes in the past has been combat science, or what I'll call combat science. Science to support this perspective or that perspective. And everybody plays their role, obviously, so I don't want to dismiss that science, but increasingly we're focused on science that we can make decisions on. So can you talk about how we build partnerships for adaptive science?
That is a great question. And I think there's a lot of progress right now. I think one of the things that is really important I want to highlight one, science communication and honing our ability to communicate science and understanding that even when you're talking to other scientists that maybe don't share your field, you need to have honed communication strategies to get it across. And so when you develop efficiencies in doing that, your ability to use the science quickly and inform adaptive management increases. So I think I'm glad that there's a focus today and a highlight on science translators. They play a critical role in allowing science to be usable, digestible, approachable for people that are going to be using it and don't have time to make graphs, don't have time to go into complex data sets and do it themselves. So that's one piece. The other thing I want to just shine a light on is I'm seeing a trend towards experimenting with an approach where we use complex models to inform decisions, but we're doing that in a way where we try to make those models very transparent, and we try to bring new voices into a room to allow them to say what they want to see modeled. So you mentioned that there are some groups that may have a more singular focus because it's an issue that they really care about, whether it's harmful algal blooms or salmon. They may want a voice. I want to see what happens if we do shut down fishing. I'm just throwing out examples. And then talk through that in a way that's grounded in a model. And I have seen examples of this in the Delta, and now with a couple different systems in the Delta, salinity management, salmon recovery. There's now leadership and facilitation towards using models and playing out in kind of a sandbox. What does that look like if we try these different scenarios? And then how do we hone them so that they become implementable? It's a new way of bringing new voices into the room, and I think that's an exciting part of how we're doing collaboration now that's new.
I think it's exciting and, of course, complicated, but building the transparency of our science, because so often these models feel like black boxes if you're not part of them. They feel like black boxes to me sometimes. Like, what did the model spit out, But so making it transparent, but then also inclusive, which is not necessarily a word that you'd attach to scientific modeling. So I really like those points because, as you know, one of the values we're working to drive across California is more inclusion, more opportunity to actually engage, particularly for communities that are impacted by these decisions. I liked your point about communications and really taking science and helping communicate to policymakers. I want to give a concrete example and a shout out to Lawrence Livermore for the work over the last few years on engineered carbon sequestration, where a lot of complex science has gone into that research at LBNL, but then they really focused on creating a policy document with a 2-page executive summary that people like me or a legislator could actually understand why it's important and necessary from LBNL's perspective to actually do this engineered carbon sequestration, and then how do we do it safely and effectively. So I think don't forget, if you're, whether you're a governmental scientist or non-governmental scientist, be able to distill and interpret the science for people that have to make the decisions, like me, that frankly aren't trained in science. Yeah. I want to shift to the other side, real talk here. Barriers, challenges to these partnerships. And naming these will be helpful because Julianne, Jason, others, CCST is really focused on reducing barriers and challenges to doing this type of partnership.
Well, I think money's the easy answer and maybe a little too convenient. There's been just an enormous largesse of state and federal funds the last few years, which has been tremendous, but the pain of actually trying to ramp up a research program, whether it's hiring the right people, whether it's putting some of the research plans in place, having very quick turnaround. You mentioned that we need answers now, and oftentimes, the role of higher education, being the research arm, yes, but also we need to train the next generation of leaders and scientists in this space, and that can take time. So being able to kind of even these things out a little bit would be great. If we could actually bank some of those funds, it would be tremendous. I understand it doesn't always work that way. I think there's a real opportunity with other stakeholder groups, whether it's the nonprofit sector or even possibly industry. In the San Joaquin Valley, we've seen a lot of interest in being able to stabilize a research workforce to be in the valley and stay in the valley and focus on these issues.
One concrete thing that we've worked to do is try to extend the time which funding can get spent, because a lot of our funding in government is episodic. To your point, one time, the Inflation Reduction Act or the surplus in California, and if you have 2 or 3 years to expend that, that's really difficult for the projects you're talking about. So we've been working to extend that actually to 5 to 7 to 9 to maybe even 11 years, where possible, to be able to create that pipeline of sustained work. Other challenges?
I would add a challenge is making sure that we've got all the right voices in the room. I mean, you brought up Indigenous partners and Indigenous science earlier. Making sure that we are incorporating these ways of understanding and thinking and managing the earth. Like, I was just out yesterday at the proposed Quetzon National Monument and learned all about this biodiversity that I had never heard of that is disappearing because the Indigenous community down there is no longer managing the land. Like, that type of science is not really being done or elevated for us, and I'd like to see more of it.
Yeah, and I'll note that, again, I'm all about concrete examples. We have a California climate assessment, which is California budget investing in downscaling climate impacts into California and doing science in California around climate. For the first time, we're on their 5th version called the fifth climate assessment. For our first time, there's actually a funding stream for Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, recognizing, the aha moment for a lot of us that are now deepening our partnership with tribes is the sophistication and the depth and the comprehensiveness of the scientific understanding that tribes have had for thousands of years that they passed along orally. That doesn't fit in the neat confines of Western science or even our, scientific agendas. But I think we all need to think about how do we bring those experts to the discussion, not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do, because frankly, their knowledge in many ways is deeper and broader than the knowledge that we bring through Western science. Other challenges?
I would add that I think a lot of these issues, I think we have to be honest, are very challenging, and they're triggering for people. So we have to acknowledge that and be ready to have hard conversations. I think sometimes we're coming into conversations these challenging issues from positions. And I think the more we can acknowledge that and be ready to listen, and vulnerable, honestly, in some of these conversations that are grounded in science, then it is helpful. There's a lot of power in facilitation, proper facilitation, to be able to make space for conversations that may be hard and deeply rooted for many groups, to then make space where people can really listen to each other. So just wanted to point out that sometimes it's not the science that you have to just get up right up there. You need to create the space to have that conversation properly. And it does take time, as Josh said. So being ready to step back and put aside the list of things to do for a moment and have that listening conversation, that's something that we all need reminders to do.
Maybe I could just add briefly to this, and Louise, you kind of mentioned, I think, from co-equal, the modeling and being able to engage with agencies and scientists. Like, I think we're really entering this era of team science, which is incredibly important to do, to be able to exchange, interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary ideas. But importantly, from the perspective of a researcher, oftentimes, professors are like their own little businesses, and running a small business is incredibly hard, right? So if we can remove a lot of the issues around contracting and payroll and everything else of running the business and let them focus on their work, and that requires a big team, and a big team needs to have cohesion and needs to have some leadership.
Yeah, and I'll just say, and this is one I want to partner with CCST on, contracting, between the state, for example, and the UC or federally funded research center is hard and difficult and tedious and too slow and too expensive. And I can tell you, I've got examples where we've had multi-million dollars to spend in state government and we've given up because the contract between our behemoth government and their behemoth government, just the contracts are too hard to do. That can't be the case. We have to reduce the bureaucracy so that this work gets done.
Yeah, one thing I see a barrier sometimes in these collaborations and partnerships is really being clear about what is the problem we're trying to solve. And I think we sometimes in these partnerships and collaborations forget to actually define that and articulate that clearly, because that is the key. Like once we define what is the problem we're trying to solve here, then we can have our various perspectives. We can have those conversations and figure out what tools are we bringing, what methods, et cetera, who needs to be in the room. And then, so I think sometimes that I've seen be a barrier in these collaborations and partnerships is when we don't take the time, which it does take time. What are we trying to solve here? Doing that first and taking the time to do that, it makes a process much easier.
Yeah, I agree. I would add a challenge, which is just visibility. I am confident that there are dozens, if not well over low hundreds of scientists, researchers that are doing work in California that would be really helpful to us in government. But we don't have visibility on that because, we don't have the connection to them. They don't have the connection to us. So how do we build visibility of what's actually out there? And to your point, how do we articulate in government specifically the research questions we have to help inform that research if it's desired by scientists, researchers? I think that'll be really helpful. If I had a magic wand, we would do sort of sectoral roundtables every year where there's a water science roundtable or a wildfire resilience science roundtable or a watershed science roundtable, just to do, Louise, what you were saying, which is bring folks together and understand what is the cutting edge research that's happening out there. But then likewise from state government, what are the questions, what are the challenges that we're struggling with to help inform? So just trying to throw different ideas out there for CCST and all partners. Okay, last question before we wrap up. What do you see as trends out there? What do you see as emerging opportunities that we should take advantage of? The hot topic this year, last couple of years, is artificial intelligence, for example. Before that, but even still, is big data. Like, what are trends or opportunities that you see that we should seize moving forward?
Well, you mentioned breakthroughs, and I think they're happening. And some of those hot topics that you just mentioned, that AI, we mentioned eDNA, we're opening, we had big data, and now we have even bigger data, and we're doing better with getting it to be more accessible with actual implementation of AB 1755, the Open and Transparent Water Data Act. So our opportunities, I would really love to see even more visualizations, real information from this newly accessible and even larger, more innovative data sets. That's where we can get real information in front of people, and I think that actually helps with stating what our questions are. So it becomes less abstract and more approachable, and then we can really start talking.
Louise, a great example of that is the California Nature website that we've got for 30 by 30. There's a commitment that we have to data transparency as part of this initiative, making sure the information is out there for people to see how we're doing, where we've got gaps, and also to take that information and use it in their own analyses and studies. And so that is one of those ways to visualize. The other thing I will say is I'm really excited to see advancements in monitoring where we can do things more remotely. Monitoring is hugely expensive for practitioners. The state often isn't able to fund it. And so the ability to use remote sensing, eDNA, some of these other things to let us learn how our work is doing and help us improve in a really efficient and fast way is something I'm excited about.
Yeah, and you're bringing up California Nature, which is canature.gov, canature.ca.gov, or no, canature.org. CaliforniaNature.ca.gov. It's really cool, and it brings up another sort of key set of partners, which are companies, which are for-profit companies. So Esri, which of course is the geospatial company based in Redlands, helped us build that. Because when we got talking, the CEO is this visionary guy, Jack Dangermond, who's committed to biodiversity, works with TNC, and said, well, what do you need? And what we said we need is like a really good geospatial interactive map that will show us what's protected, what's not protected, what's got high biodiversity values, where are publicly accessible places, et cetera. So now we have this built. And it's not the end-all be-all, but it's a great example of where we're partnering with a for-profit entity, which frankly a lot of our departments are already licensed with, to build a model that can be useful more broadly than state government.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that I heard both monitoring and some of the remote sensing applications. We've been using the OpenET product a lot to really better understand water balance in the San Joaquin Valley with the onset of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the multi-benefit land repurposing. And
take a moment to explain OpenET just for the layperson, just a couple sentences, because it's incredibly cool. I couldn't believe that it actually works.
So OpenET is a remote sensing product, a combination of folks from EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, Desert Research Institute, NASA, et cetera, to use remote sensing information to actually quantify the amount of water lost to the atmosphere from evapotranspiration, both in natural lands and agricultural lands. It's certainly been a game changer. I would go so far as to say that most scientists think that maybe it underpredicts a little bit, and most growers think it overpredicts a little bit. So maybe right in the middle is about right. But what I'm really struck by in the San Joaquin Valley with Sigma is that we estimate about 700,000 acres of land will need to be retired or have an alternate land use. As it turns out, that's about the same amount of area that's going to be needed with renewable energy, solar production to meet the goals of the state in terms of a zero emissions target. Perhaps those are synonymous, but I'd like to think that there is the possibility to actually grow food and generate electricity at the same time. So a lot of our research now is focused on what's known as agrivoltaics, that's combining solar production with food production. And there are a lot of engineering challenges around this. You can imagine the movement of tractors, spray, dust, et cetera. But we think there's an opportunity there to really kind of rethink working landscapes. And this is important because of 3030, this is the complement. It's everything that's left, and we can't just leave it alone. So what I'm excited by, rewilding some of these marginal areas. What I'm excited by is combining the voltaics with hedgerows and pollinators. What we do know is that the microclimate under these actually increases soil moisture, decreases temperature, increases relative humidity, which is great for ecosystems. So I think these things can be quite compatible, and if we can put more ecology into technology, I think we'll be doing well.
That's incredible, really inspiring. I'll also say that OpenET is a great example that there may be data that's being collected or generated that we haven't yet put to good use. I mean, working with NASA, the amount of satellite data that we have on our Earth systems is remarkable. And I think a lot of us think that's a real untapped reservoir of data, of information that actually can help us with natural resources management. So it has been a fascinating conversation. I hope you found it helpful and interesting, and what I think is a great way to kick off the day. So please join me in thanking our panelists here today.